Hey people, time has come again for me to do another one of these videos. MeshBrush version 1.7 is almost complete now, and I'll probably submit it for review to the Asset Store team tonight. And I'm very eager to announce the release notes for this update. This time I focused primarily on making the tool easier to use and, well, more pleasant to look at, meaning I remade the UI from scratch with, of course, a button that allows for switching back and forth between classic and modern UI right here in the inspector. Furthermore, I have done a lot of small bug fixes here and there, and I managed to improve the performance a little bit too. For instance, I completely rewrote and simplified the MeshBrush template management code and the algorithms responsible for gathering data. It's now 3 times as simple. Well, literally, because before I had one transitory data holder class, which was called template data, and 2 overloaded methods for loading a template, one without and one with a specified path parameter. And, well, of course, the saving method, which hasn't changed that much though. Whereas now there's only one method for saving and one for loading, and the data is written directly from the MeshBrush instance and thus doesn't need a transitory data class. Consequently, it also got a bit faster compared to the previous version. I also now added many necessary undo stack entries for various MeshBrush related actions, like loading up a template can now be undone, for instance, as well as deleting fields inside the set of meshes to paint and resetting randomizers, resetting, well, these reset buttons here in the inspector. Then there is this constant mesh density toggle in the inspector. You can, with this, use an optional mesh density value to define the amount of meshes to place, instead of a traditional fixed number. This keeps the density of the painted objects homogeneous and, well, constant, even when painting with different brush sizes, but I'll show you that in a moment. Let's get back to this new reworked modern UI. It's got dynamically resizable preview icons, and you have hidden controls for each field. There's drag and drop functionality in both the set of meshes to paint and the favorites list. It's this blue plus icon here. You can drag and drop your meshes that you want to add to the list directly onto this plus area here. The same applies for MeshBrush template files here over here in the favorites list. So the controls in the modern UI are pretty simple. You can press your left mouse button over one of these fields and this will ping the corresponding asset inside the project panel. It's got this smooth yellow rectangle shape around its file name. Then you can delete or nullify a field by pressing your middle mouse button or mouse wheel over it. This deletes the field's value, but it won't remove the field from the list entirely. You can now left click on this empty field, and since there is no object to select, or ping as the editor function that does this suggests calling it, this object picker window will appear instead. This way you can assign a new valid mesh to the field. Oh, and you can obviously also reassign your meshes by directly dragging and dropping them onto a field, like this. There's really many ways you can utilize this modern UI, as you can see. Everyone can choose his preferred way of doing. I really wanted this new UI to be as flexible and versatile as possible, so there's really many ways that you can utilize it. And to completely remove a field, press the right mouse button over it. You won't be asked whether you're sure or not, so yeah. Well, it doesn't even matter. As I said before, there's plenty of stuff now that has become undoable in MeshBrush. So you can also undo removing a field if you accidentally do this. To add multiple assets at once to the set of meshes to paint via drag and drop, you will have to lock your inspector with this right here. This way you can select your meshes without losing the inspector's focus. Once you added them to the list, If you leave the lock on, that's fine, but deselecting the MeshBrush object will unlink its inspector from the instance, meaning you won't be able to paint any meshes, even though the inspector is visible. It does happen sometimes that one forgets to unlock the inspector, and that's why I added this comfortable button here in case this happens. By pressing it, you automatically reselect your object and can start painting again. This also applies for global mesh painting, so don't worry. Just left-clicking on the plus icon here will add an empty field, exactly like in the classic UI. And the same thing applies to the favorites lists, except that here uh, clicking it will open a file selection dialog, which only allows for selecting a single template file. Whereas with drag and drop, you can add multiple template files to the favorites list at once. Keep in mind that only valid .meshbrush template files can be added to the list like this. So please keep in mind that trying to drag and drop a sound effect or some sort of prefab into the favorites list will result in it being rejected. And with multiple files selected, only valid .meshbrush files will be added to the favorites list. Now let's get back to this constant mesh density toggle in the inspector. I mainly added this feature because of a user request, and the reason for that is known among all of you MeshBrush users out there, I'm sure. You know how it goes. You set up your MeshBrush and everything's fine, and then you change the brush size, and you either end up having too many meshes being placed when shrinking the brush, or too few of them randomly scattered around when you increase the brush size. To prevent this from happening, you can replace the traditional amount of meshes to paint per stroke with a density value. The unit of this density value is meshes per square meter, as Unity uses the metric system. This means that if I use a mesh density of, say, 5 meshes per square meter, you end up painting exactly 5 meshes given that your circle brush area is 1 square meter. If you then increase your brush area to, say, 3 square meters, you'd end up having 3 times 5 meshes inside your brush area. That's 15. It's simple maths, really. Just remember that the area is not the radius. In the case of this example, to have an area of exactly 3 square meters, you'd need a brush radius of 2.19 meters, not 3. That's because of the formula. But this was just for you to understand. You have to play around with this value, and you'll notice the higher the density, the more meshes you end up painting. But it will always be constant between the different brush sizes compared to the traditional fixed number. And last but not least, like with the traditional fixed number of meshes to paint, you can choose to have your density picked randomly from a defined range. Just set a minimum and maximum value and you're good to go. So that's it for this video. I really hope you like this new update, especially the new UI. And for this update, I really recommend that you do a fresh install of MeshBrush. So when you download the update, instead of just importing it, delete your old MeshBrush folder first and then import your package. This is because I changed and simplified some things in the code, like for example the way MeshBrush handles templates. And doing a clean install probably avoids some eventual interferences. Don't worry, old templates saved with previous versions of MeshBrush are forward compatible with 1.7. Just make sure you don't accidentally leave any of your favorite templates inside the MeshBrush folder hierarchy before deleting it. Save them, move them elsewhere, and keep them. And if you wish to keep your favorites list too, you can move that XML file to another temporary folder and put it back in this folder right here, right after installing MeshBrush. Just overwrite it. I also removed the annoying resources folder with the GUI icons in it. It's useless practically because I now store the images as raw byte arrays inside MeshBrush source code. I hope you like this hidden compact approach. So let me know if you like it and have a great time developing your projects. Cheers!